Happy 4th of July weekend. I always know when it's 4th of July because it is really, really hot outside. It's like that, it gets right to that uncomfortable hot. I was looking at the weather last night, and we are just about 2 or 3 days away from triple-digit weather. Yay! It's that point in the summer when things are getting really, really hot, but I love 4th of July. 4th of July is one of those fun times during the year where I get to gather with our family and with our friends and celebrate freedom. But one thing I'm always really excited about on 4th of July and on any holiday is the food. We love to get together and cook a lot of food. Burgers and hot dogs, right? All of the good stuff, potato salad, but of course the desserts, right? We like a really good dessert too. So on 4th of July, we have a bunch of different pies, and we have this one that looks very patriotic because it has blueberries and strawberries in it. And it seems like the holidays are centered around food. There's something about food that connects us. There's something about food that brings us closer together with one another and reminds us in some weird way how to be grateful for all the things that we have. Well, when I was a little bit younger, I won't tell you how old because it was a little embarrassing, I got to learn a family recipe of a pie that my grandmother makes. She makes a special pecan pie, and it's got a special ingredient in it. And one Thanksgiving, actually, we're making this pecan pie together, and she's finally showing me how to make this special pie. And we get all of the ingredients in there, and we're cooking it, and we go to bake it, and then it's time to put it in front of our family. So I am just completely proud of this pie that we've put in front of our family. And so we cut it up, and we divvy it up, and everybody goes to take a bite. And they have this weird look on their face, like, I really want to be encouraging, but this is really bad. That kind of like, yeah. And so I finally asked somebody, what is wrong? They're like, it's not good. It's not good at all. And so I go back and I talk to my grandmother. She's still in the kitchen, and I go, okay, so we're not getting rave reviews. And she looks back over the list, and what we realized in the midst of adding the really important ingredients, we forgot one really important ingredient, which was sugar. I heard somebody say it over here, sugar. We forgot the sugar. And so we were eating this pie that tasted a little bland, but brought us a little bit of a memory, connected us in a funny way. Food has this funny way of connecting us together. And today in the scripture, I want to read you a story that is familiar, that also centers around food. We're going to read this morning from the Gospel of Mark. It's a story that's found in 3 out of our 4 Gospels. It's a story that you maybe have heard before about some bread and some fish. So we're going to start in verse 30 of chapter 6 in Mark. It says, the apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. He said to them, come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them. And they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As he went ashore, he saw a great crowd. He had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. When it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, this is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late. Send them away so that we may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat. But he answered them, you give them something to eat. They said to him, are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? He said to them, he being Jesus, how many loaves have you? Go and see. When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he ordered them to get all of the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. He looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave it to the disciples to set before the people. He divided the 2 fish among them all. All ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of fish. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. They ate and were filled. So we look at this scripture today, and it seems really simple, right? This is a story about food. More specifically, this is a miracle about food. And the miracle in and of itself is about duplication of food, right? Something small growing into something kind of big, something that feeds a lot of people. But I wonder if that's all that we see in this story, if it's maybe eating a pie without sugar, if it maybe makes the story a little bland, maybe something we don't necessarily want to hear again or want to hear again. Maybe there's more to this story than just the duplication of food. So when we look at this scripture this morning, the first thing that pops into my mind, and the first thing when I see when I read it, is that Jesus changes their plans. They have this plan, right? They've been working all day, Jesus and the disciples. They've been feeding the hungry. They've been healing the sick. They've been going from town to town, ministering to people, sharing Christ's love. And they're tired and they're exhausted. And so Jesus sees this in the disciples and said, let's go away. Let's go away to a deserted place for a little while and just rest. Now, the disciples are thrilled with this, right? They haven't even eaten, is what the scripture says. They haven't even eaten all day, and they're exhausted. But what happens? A group of people begin to see that they're trying to get off into the distance, and they follow them. And it seems as though they take a little shortcut because they not only follow them, but they get to the destination before Jesus and the disciples do. So imagine you are going to a deserted place. Maybe it's a vacation. Maybe it's the beach. Sounds really nice, right? And you get there, and everybody else in your life, in your workplace, in your family, and all of your friends are all there waiting for you. It all of a sudden becomes not the most relaxing environment. It all of a sudden becomes not the most exciting environment where you can go to just unwind. And so Jesus looks at the crowd, and instead of saying to them, we'll deal with you in the morning. We'll be back in the morning. We're going to go away for a little bit, but we'll be back at the crack of dawn. He looks at them, and the scripture says he has compassion on them. Can you imagine how irritated the disciples were? Isn't it a little bit too late in the day? Aren't we just a little bit too hungry to have compassion on the people that we've been serving and healing and loving on all day? And the scripture says Jesus had compassion on them, for they were like sheep without a shepherd. It seems as though this imagery of Jesus as the shepherd repeats itself over and over and over again. And in the Gospel of Mark, what we find is that the disciples find themselves in this position where they're basically the sheep over and over and over again. The disciples don't seem to have a good understanding of what's going on, and they don't seem to have a good understanding of how much work it's going to take. They don't seem to have a good understanding of how much it's going to cost them. The extent of exhaustion you may feel, the amount of hunger you may feel in order for others to feel God's love. It seems as though Jesus understood that this was the gig. This was what we needed to do. It was hard work. But the disciples, maybe not so much. You know, they say that you can tell a lot by a person by their hands. For instance, you maybe wouldn't want to hire somebody to do some yard work, maybe a farmer, if their hands didn't show the work of a farmer. Have you ever seen a farmer's hands? They're almost always completely filled with calluses or blisters because the farmer's hands are hands that have seen hard work. They're hands that know what hard work looks like. You trust a farmer when you look at their hands and you see the amount of work and labor that they have put into the job that they're doing. You know the phrase, being the hands of Christ. I wonder what it looks like for our church to be the hands of Christ. What would our hands look like if we were really doing the work? If we were really about the work that Jesus talked about? At the end of the day when we're exhausted, at the end of the day when we're tired and hungry, and Jesus looks at them again and has compassion on them. What is our response? So the disciples had a response. They tried to, do a little deliberation with Jesus, say, "No, Jesus, let's not get carried away. We don't necessarily have to do all of it. How about we just meet in the middle halfway? We'll stay out here for a little while, we'll minister to them, but once it's time to eat, we'll send them back into the village and they can get their own food, and then we'll meet back up with them in the morning." And so not only does Jesus have compassion on them, he then looks at the disciples after telling them that they're going to stay and minister to these people. He looks at the disciples and says, "You feed them. You feed them." The disciples were used to Jesus being the one who does the work. They were used to being followers of Christ. And then this person that they've been following, this person that they've been doing work alongside of, instead of doing the miracle right then and there, he looks at the disciples and says, "You do it. You feed them." I'm reminded of a psychologist that I heard about a few years ago, Dr. Walter Mischel. In the 1960s, Dr. Walter Mischel was known for something that you may have heard of before called the marshmallow test. The marshmallow test was this test that they did with young children where they would put them in a room and put a marshmallow in front of them and tell them, "If you can wait and not eat the marshmallow, I'll give you 2 in 5 minutes." And then, of course, you leave the room and then you watch the video of the child sitting on their hands and staring at the marshmallow, desiring to eat this one marshmallow and having to decide back and forth, do I eat this one marshmallow right now? Or do I wait and get 2 here in just 5 minutes? Well, while Dr. Mischel is known for that particular test, for that evaluation, where that started was this understanding of personalities. Back in the 1960s, there was this understanding that the personalities were fixed. They were things that could not be changed. And so if you're introverted, you're introverted. If you're extroverted, you're extroverted. If you're a typically pretty happy and friendly person, the assessment was, well, then you're just a friendly person. But it became tricky because it also meant if you were an honest person, then you were an honest person. But if you were a dishonest person, then that's just who you were. And if you were a criminal, then you were just a criminal. And so Dr. Mischel began to do a series of research around children, beginning to look not only at their personality, but their behavior. And what he found was that there was not a trend. Because a child was maybe dishonest in one setting, meaning maybe in math class they might have cheated, but on another test in a different class, they were honest. And so this entire personality assessment about a person either being honest or dishonest seemed inconsistent. And so he came up with something that's called the situation problem. The situation problem talks about how, yes, our personality is something that is very much a part of us, but how much of our personality depends on the situation that we're in. How much of our personality depends on the situation we're in, and how often are we repeating those same situations? If our personality is consistent, it has probably more to do with the fact that we find ourselves in situations that repeat that personality in us. What Dr. Mischel would call that is a role. That we get put into situations where we begin playing a role. Now, not all of these roles are bad, right? The role of mom, the role of dad, the role of sister, the role of pastor. We know these situations, and they're not all bad situations. But what Dr. Mischel began to look at is, what if those situations were not working in your favor? And what if you were looking at the situation and identifying yourself in a way that could not be changed? If we were to rethink this one piece, could we maybe save some people from some criminal acts? Could we maybe become a little bit more forgiving of someone who does something wrong? So the situation problem today in our text is very easy to see, right? The situation is that these people are hungry and that they need to be fed, but the role of the disciples is what's questioned, right? Jesus looks at them and says, "You feed them." And they're caught off guard because this is not their role. They're in a situation that maybe seems familiar, but the role they're being asked to play is now a little bit different. And Jesus looks at them and says, "You feed them." What kind of miracle is this? What kind of miracle are we talking about? So the disciples began to put the people into groups. They began to circle on the green pasture and make groups of 50 or 100. Now, when I first imagined this in my mind, I imagined it somewhat like a high school cafeteria. All of the kids sitting around tables, lunch tables. But what I began to realize was a little bit of a flaw in this image in my head is that the tables of people began to look very similar. Right? You've been in a high school cafeteria. There was a table of jocks, and there was a table of cheerleaders, and there was a table of nerds, and there was a table of the drama students. And what I began to realize was that's probably not what the situation looked like at all. As the people began to sit in groups, I imagine that they began to sit next to people maybe that were not like them. They began to eat next to people who maybe were not from the same region or the same village. They began to be in community. Communion and community, right? Those words are so close to each other. They began to be in community with people that were very, very different from them. And I wonder what that scene might have looked like because it's not a scene that I'm terribly used to seeing. And I wonder if that's the real miracle. If the real miracle here is not the duplication of food, but the miracle of community that happens. Community that is diverse and different. Community where we don't have to stay in the same roles. Where we don't always have to be the exact same. Maybe in a position where God calls us out of that a little bit differently. So that marshmallow test I was telling you about. Dr. Michelle says that there's a little bit different of an understanding to that. So you put the marshmallow in front of the child, right? And they have to decide whether or not to eat it right then or to wait. Now, what became of this study was a really understanding of gratification, right? If you could delay gratification just for 5 minutes, the study showed that students would do much better in school. They would go on to be more successful. But if they couldn't delay that gratification, the students didn't do as well. But what they found was it was not as much about delaying gratification as it was about reframing the situation. The students who could delay gratification, but then also reframe the situation, understood their role in the situation a little bit differently. Dr. Michelle's work ultimately went on to say that humans are fundamentally flexible, which means that when we get into situations that are different or situations that are hard, we as humans have the capacity to go into a different role. Not just to be the person we think we're supposed to be or be the person who kind of crawls into a shell, but instead we have the capacity to go into a situation and do something different. What is the miracle here? What does Jesus do in this community? Jesus sees a situation problem and handles the situation differently than almost anyone else would, being tired and hungry, and then looks at the disciples and says, your role is maybe different than what you think it is. Your role is maybe more than what you think it is. What does it look like for us to be in community together? To be in a community that looks different, where our circles are a little bit different. And you might be wondering, what does any of this have to do with freedom? We live in a culture, right, of freedom. And I wonder sometimes if we use that freedom in the way that God intended. Because we have the freedom to come here. We have the freedom to work in different places. We have the freedom to choose so much of what is in front of us. Yet what we choose often in this freedom is the same situations and the same people that we're used to, that are familiar, that feel good to us. Now, there's nothing wrong with that feeling good to us, but what I hear in the scripture today, what I see in the miracle today, is God calling us out of our comfort zone, telling us we maybe have a situation problem. Do you know the role you're supposed to play? Do you know what it really looks like to do hard work, to be the hands of Christ in a world that is divided and divisive? We live in a culture where things are heightened right now, a culture where things are not easy, and we are constantly faced with choices. And I wonder what kind of choice it says about us that we come to this place on a Sunday morning, on a holiday weekend, to be in community and to challenge ourselves again to know the role that God has called us to play. The role of loving others like God has loved us and loving our neighbor that is different than us, that neighbor that is maybe hard to love, loving that neighbor as we love ourselves.